Welcome to 56-Bit Cloud Cafe, your go-to destination for all tech topics in the cloud. I'm Athir Zalal.
And I'm Patrick Camilleri. And together we'll be addressing various cloud topics.
Hello everyone and welcome back. Today we will go through the essentials of identity and access management, IAM in short. Also, we will be talking about its role and significance to cloud environments. So, let's kickstart our first episode. IAM, it sounds important. What's the deal and what does it actually do for our tech teams in simple terms?
Okay, so IAM, or Identity and Access Management, is very, very important, as you said. It is what controls what is allowed to go into an AWS account and what that person or that application ultimately is allowed to do. And this is the basics of any IAM, any identity and access management system, whatever the cloud or whatever the software that you might be using. So it controls the identity, who is that person, we call it authentication. So my name is Patrick and I am really Patrick that is going in. I am not a fake, it's true, it is Patrick. So that is authentication. And then there is authorization. Authorization is once Patrick is logged in, once that person or that application is logged in, what can that person or application do? So the identity and the access level. That's what IAM does. So of course it is an essential part of security in the cloud, because if you have bad identities, then people or applications you don't want them to go in will go in. That's a bad thing. And ultimately, once they are in, what can they do? The access levels, again, if they are not set correctly, that's a bad thing, because even though a person you might want them to go in, but you might want them to only have read-only access on your AWS account, and instead you give them full administrator permissions. That's obviously not a good thing. So setting the IAM permissions and identities properly is an important tenet of security in AWS.
Okay, perfect. Then even if our listeners aren't tech people or directly related to the tech team, why is it important for them to know about IAM? What's the real-world impact on daily work here?
So the impact of misconfiguring IAM, which is ultimately one service in AWS out of many, but that service integrates with all the other services. It allows you to do identity management, it allows you to define who goes in, and ultimately what that person or application that goes in, what they can do. So misconfiguring that could really cause security issues. It's probably the most common security flaw in cloud computing in terms of how it is configured. So this is something which is, if you configure it badly in on-premise, you'll have the same issues. If you're configuring it badly in any other cloud, you'll have the same issue. So this is essential in general in IT. And it is also the most common misconfiguration we see, which allows the wrong people, the wrong applications to go in or have the wrong access in the cloud. So the repercussions are obvious, right? The security element is extremely strong here, and configuring it properly is very important. Of course, it's also what you need to do to actually get access. So if I should be getting access as Patrick, then I will go in, and if I have the right permissions, I'm allowed to do what I would like to do. There is obviously a misconfiguration on the other side, where I'm not given too much permissions, but I'm given too little permissions. So if I'm given too little permissions, what happens is that I will get frustrated, because I will go and, for example, I want to administer my EC2 instances. I go switch on a server, an instance, and I cannot because I don't have the right permissions. It's not as serious as having too much permissions, but it's also important that the people who are actually working have the right permissions to do their work. There is also an element of how difficult it is to go into an AWS account. So if I have to put in my password, there is multi-factor authentication, which makes it a double entry system whenever going in. So all these things will increase the amount of effort to go in and be secure. And it's always a balance. There is always a balance between frustration versus security. We try to go towards security, but it's also important to take in consideration the people who are constantly working in that environment, that they don't get too frustrated.
Okay, then break it down for me. What are these users, groups, and roles in IAM? Why do they matter when we are dealing with Amazon's cloud?
So to explain how IAM works, it's important to go into the process of what an AWS account is and how to create it. So an AWS account, you can think of it as this virtual repository of all your AWS resources. So if you have 10 servers, 2 S3 buckets, 1 RDS database, which we've discussed in previous episodes, all those will be inside an AWS account. There is no option. That's where they will be. That account has an ID, and that account belongs to a person or a company. It legally belongs to them, and they are the ones who will be paying for the usage. Now, why am I saying this? Because ultimately, that's the first thing you do. You go and create an account. You sign up for an AWS account. When you're signing up for an account, you have to give it a username and a password. The username needs to be an email, and the password needs to be a strong password which allows you to go in. This initial username and password is called the root user. The root user is a very important user because it's the first one, and it's the only one that exists. That is the root user. It has full permissions on AWS, and because it is the only one, you cannot create more than one. It's also important that once you create the account, once there is a root user, you stop using it. So that is best practice, that you stop using the root user. How do you do that? So once you give it an email and a password, you're logged into the account. You can start using it, yes, but it's not suggested to do that. Instead, it's suggested to, first of all, switch on multi-factor authentication. That basically is those one-time codes that you get on your mobile using applications such as Google Authenticator, for example, and there are many others. There are other ways of doing multi-factor authentication, but that's best practice, right? Use a strong password, a multi-factor authentication mechanism for your root user, then stop using it. So how do you stop using it? By going to the IAM console. This is what we do whenever we create an AWS account. Go into the IAM console. This is a global service. There is no need to choose a region. It works globally. In there, go and create a user. And probably that first user will be an administrator. He or she will have full access to that particular account. Once that user is created, then stop using the root user. Stop using the credentials of the root user. Log out and log in with the new user, administrator user you created. Now, going forward, that's what we will do. We will use these IAM users to administer the account. You might ask, why all this complexity? Why is there a root user in the first place? You might think of it like this. So a root user is tied to the AWS account itself. There is one root user per account, and it's also an older system. It actually existed before IAM even existed. IAM, on the other hand, allows you to create as many users, as many groups, and eventually we'll talk about roles, as you want. So one of the security best practices in general in IT is to have always, if there is a human being logging into something, that human being is the only one that knows his or her credentials. You should never share credentials. So if I have 6 administrators, each one, Joe, Jane, Jack, whatever, or each one get their own credentials. And these credentials will be a username. It can be any word, it can be an email as well, whatever, in IAM, and the password. So Joe, Jack, and Jane, they get their own username and password. And why is that important in security? Because there is what is called attribution. So if Joe does something bad, there is logging in the background, which is basically writing down everything that Joe does. And if the username is Joe, then you know it is Joe. If there is a shared credentials, then you cannot be sure it was Joe. So even legally, then you can, be sure and you have proof that it was only that administrator who did whatever they did. So that's the first best practice. Stop using the root account because there can only be one, and start using one username and password for each human individual. Now, those that you have just created, those are called users in IAM, and we usually tie them to humans. Now, you might have a lot of these, you might have hundreds of these, and it's important that you have a way of properly managing them without too much hassle. So every user will have what is called a policy attached to it. A policy is, so the user is the authentication, who that person is. The policy is the authorization. What can that person do once they are logged in? So let's say you want Joe to be read-only and you want Jane to be full administrator. Now you can attach a policy directly. One will be read-only policy, the other will be full administrator policy. But ideally instead use groups. The reason is that this reduces human error. So groups allow you to attach a policy to them. So let's say we have a read-only group and we create a different group called admin group. So the read-only group has the read-only policy, the admin group has the admin policy. And like that, all I have to do now is attach users to those groups. I don't need to touch anything in the policies, I just start attaching users and that user will get that policy. So Joe will be attached to the read-only group, and once logged in, he will only have read-only access to the AWS resources. Same with Jane. Once attached to the admin group, she will have full admin. Now, between read-only and full admin, there is a big gap that you can have a lot in the middle. Maybe you don't want to have full admin, but you want part admin. So you want maybe the user to be able to switch on EC2 servers only. They are not able to delete those servers. They only can switch them on or switch them off, right? You can do whatever you want with policies, and we'll discuss this in future episodes in more detail. So with that, we have users, groups, and yes, policies can be attached to both those users and groups. Finally, there is roles. Roles is something that probably we should discuss in a lot more detail in a future episode, but in general, you can think of them as a way for AWS to provide temporary credentials. So the users we were talking about before, once you create a credential for a user, meaning a username and a password, those credentials are permanent. Permanent means they will never change unless you go and change them manually. That's what permanent is. If you leave them the same, they will remain the same forever. And that is, they are still secure, but they are not as secure as temporary passwords. Temporary passwords, on the other hand, they expire. So after, let's say, 3 days, they expire and you have to change them. Now, the way we do temporary credentials in AWS is called roles. And we should definitely have a lot more to talk about there because they are definitely a best practice to use. So in general, users, groups, and roles are the main resources in IAM. And each one works within an AWS account globally. They are available through all the regions in that account.
Okay, so as we wrap up this episode, remember, IAM isn't just a tech puzzle. It's a key to unlocking a secure and efficient cloud journey for your company. Until then, happy cloud computing. If you have questions, suggestions, or want to share your feedback, connect with us on social media.
Also, don't forget to subscribe to our podcast and to leave us a review to help others find their way to the Cloud Cafe.